Good morning and welcome to the new edition of Dr. Lamba's Awakening Call. India sometimes witnesses very strange directions, and at times one feels that there's a disconnect between the thought and the process. We have seen decisions being taken that have no meaning, and the latest RBI recommendation apparently looks very good. And when I compared it to the other countries, I found that there's a lot of merit in that. The RBI's recommendation to allow large industrial houses to own banks, which has been agitating all discerning minds, is good in concept, but as they say, good intentions are a sure pathway to hell if those intentions are not executed in the proper context. I remember a documentary Netflix, Bad Boy Billionaire, and that documentary related to the lives and the scandals of three Indian businessmen, Vijay Mallya, Nirav Chaudhary, Subrata Roy, who became bywords for corruption, embezzlement, fraud, cheating of the banks. And all three businessmen had political contacts at the highest level. The presidents and the leaders would kowtow to them and go out of the way to help them. And they utilized their political contacts as well as illegal means of accessing thousands of crores, that's a billions of dollars from the banks and then embezzled them. And now RBI is saying that the same people should be permitted to own banks is simply a disaster. We have seen here in Canada that big businesses have owned banks like President Choice, owned by Loblaws. There's no denying about that, and that's pretty successful. But we have got to see the cultural and the historical context. Just imagine what would have happened if Malia or Nirav Modi or Subrata Roy had been allowed to own banks. They would simply have gone to those self-owned banks to lend them not hundreds and thousands and millions, but billions of hard-earned money of the investors and the depositors. And this money would have been used for their own selfish, nefarious ends. The crooked businesses would increase manifold. And that's the fear which is agitating the minds of the people who can think, who can discern. What would happen is that a few dubious hands who own those banks would utilize the hard earned money of honest, middle, and marginal class even for their own political and financial power. And that's not something required. What would happen? Ultimately, those banks owned by the industrial houses would go bust. Millions of depositors would face ruin because their life savings would be gone. And the government would have spent millions of rupees of the taxpayers' money to rescue them. Isn't this outrageous? It is. And yet, when the Reserve Bank governor recommends this and the government goes gaga on such a proposal, it is astonishing. The ruination of the hundreds of thousands of the depositors we have seen earlier, and this would be made very easy, feasible, possible by the ridiculous recommendation by the Committee of the Reserve Bank of India to allow large industrial houses to own banks. We have seen the scandals of LIC, PNB, and others who gave loans to these sharks. And they, executives and the boards and the directors, didn't lose a penny, but the depositors lost the money indirectly, or directly, and indirectly it's as the taxpayers because the rescuing was done with the taxpayer money. As a matter of fact, checks and balances are the crying need in any responsible governance. Without checks and balances, anybody would go astray. And with this conflict of interest, that action must not be permitted. But here we see the conflict of interest is not only there, but it's paramount. Lenders always want to ensure that the loans are legitimate. That's A. They're secure and they're safe. Borrowers seek loans by fair means and by foul. They misrepresent, they do anything to get the money, easy money, which most of them, or some of them, like Nirav Modi and others, have no intention of paying back. And a borrower who owns a bank can play around with the savings of the millions of depositors. So to prevent that conflict of interest, industrialists and bankers must remain apart. When they are one, that's a click. And here, if you are both, your right hand giving money to your left hand. And that is why many countries, including USA, prohibit large industries from owning banks. I'm amazed that in Canada they have permitted President Choice Loblaws to own this PC Financial. And this practice is followed because that has otherwise would embed a conflict of interest. And the conflict of interest goes against the very concept of fiduciary responsibility. And yet RBI wants to do it. Apparently, RBI committee seeks ways to expand the banking system. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. But the banking system can be expanded without resorting to this dubious manner. If we look at the ratio of the banking credit to the GDP in India, it's barely 50% against 175% in China and nearly 200% in USA. But even at this low ratio, Indian banks struggle with enormous bad debts, NPAs, non-performing assets abound. Then what the government does is they either take over the bank or they underwrite the losses or they merge the banks. And this low ratio, coupled with the bad debts, has increased still under the new pandemic conditions. And this is not only because of the people like Malia and Modi and Roy. It is enormous bad debts are there. But this is also because in the time of recessionary activity, legitimate loans go bad. Unforeseeable hurdles are there, which are common in India's public sector. So, and in India, we have seen that the bank culture has reeked of political and business interference to an extent where it becomes nauseating. You remember there used to be loan melas, fairs, where people would be given loan without any guarantee. Everybody will get, say, 5,000 rupees just for the asking. And people knew there's no returning back the loan. Political parties would arrange these loan melas, the fairs where the loans would be given to the people in return for the vote at the time of polls. So this political prompting of the bad loans and then business loans with a amounting to huge number of crores of rupees to the favored cronies. The situation in the private banks is better, definitely. In India, there are two sets of banks: the government banks, the public owned banks, and the private banks. And the public banks are horrible. Private banks are better, but they are still riddled with misgovernance. India saw recently Yes Bank undergoing this calamity and ICIC Bank. And apart from that, banks, they are large non banking financial institutions, NBFCs, who the largest of these two have gone bust, ILFS and Diwan Housing. These two have just gone bust. Belly up, they're floating in the ocean. And they were supposed to be very good. The 2008 financial crisis that hit India has caused enormous damage to the government revenues because government wanted to rescue the banks. But the financial system has not as yet recovered from that. The public sector banks, which were placed under prompt corrective action, have still not come out. And this what is this prompt corrective action? This is a cover for saying that the performance was so horrible, so wretched, so crooked that they could not be trusted any longer to make industrial loans. So answer to all that is not to allow large industries to open banks. Large industries are not safe owners. Business history in India is littered with big names that crashed. Malia, of course, is an excellent example. Perfectly legitimate business in Kingfisher Airlines, and that got bust. RBI committee is living in a fool's paradise. They think that the stringent rules and monitoring would ensure that a bank owned by an industrialist would not lend money to the connected business. This is impossible. How can an employee of an industrialist refuse loan to the boss or his friend on technical grounds? They will invent the ways to circumvent all the rules. And Bad Boy Billionaires has shown how massive loans are diverted to the dubious characters even without their owning the bank. And if they own the bank, wow, this is adding another benefit. India has a good record. I don't deny it of non-industrial businesses becoming banks. HDFC Bank is supposed to be one of the best banks in the world. All large NBFCs can be allowed to banks. Why not? Let these NBFCs, non-banking financial institutions, let them be converted into banks. But there should be one provision that they have no links with business. Then the microfinancing institutions that started small have now become big, like Bandhan Bank, Ujjan, Equities. So they converted themselves into finance banks, subject to the lending limits. I fully agree that many NBFCs and microfinancing may prefer not to become banks. But if permission is given, many would come. At least half a dozen I can count. Those institutions will become good banks. And India has no shortage of non industrial candidates with good lending records to open banks. Then RBI is a licensed payment banks, which include telecom companies which promote electronic payments. And payment banks are not allowed to take deposits. They cannot make loans like universal banks. And RBI committee thinks that the payment banks should be allowed to become universal banks. Again, forgetting that there is a clear conflict of interest. And that is why people like Arvindra Subramaniam, people like Shankaracharya, Vijay Kelkar, and I know Vijay personally when he was the finance secretary, Viral Acharya, former RBI deputy governor, all of them say no, this is one of the biggest stupidities the government can ever make. So ignoring sane advice, ignoring sensible thought that the conflict of interest should be avoided, it would be imperative for the Modi government to throw the recommendation of RBI in the dustbin where it deserves to be. Otherwise, they are playing ducks and drakes with the country's finance and with millions of the people who would entrust their hard earned money to these banks so that the Seth can take benefit and go gallivanting, live on the hard earned money of others, and create a stink that shall be intolerable. Let the bad boy billionaires not become bankers. That's important. Thank you.